Today's topic is something that you simply cannot avoid in 2018. Our esteemed guest lecturer, Professor T.L. Taylor from MIT, is going to share her extensive knowledge on esports and live streaming, huge phenomenon. As usual, we have question and answers session at the end of the lecture. So prepare your questions and you can post them also on the live streams chat. So we'll pick them up for the session. So without further ado, welcome to the stage, Professor T.L. Taylor.
So thanks everyone for coming. Yes, I know how end of terms are, so I appreciate you being here for this. I apologize in advance because I'm going to read, because my jet lag will get the better of me otherwise. But hopefully I have a lot of interesting pictures that will capture your attention. So thanks very much. I'm really excited to be here. I lived and worked in Denmark and Sweden for almost a decade, so it's always a little bit like coming home when I get to come back to any of the Nordic countries. So I'm a qualitative sociologist who's been working on internet and gaming culture since the 1990s. These are some of my books so far. So I wrote a book on EverQuest, for those of you who played a very old school MMO. Did a book on Method, and my book on esports came out in 2012, pre the current hype bubble we are in. And actually at the time it wasn't clear that esports was going to go anywhere, so it's really a history book at this point. So I want to talk today about my latest research project on game live streaming that's going to be published in October with Princeton University Press. There's also going to be a free Creative Commons version that'll come out at the same time at watchmeplay.cc. So that research was conducted from about 2012 to 2015 during the first period of the platform Twitch's life. And in that book I discuss the history of live streaming, offer an analysis of variety streamers, streamers who play lots of different kinds of games, look at things like governance, intellectual property, and regulation, and I'll discuss today new form of media labor that's arising around esports. And I'm happy to chat about any of those topics. I've really distilled down a lot into this, and I'm just going to pick on a few things to highlight, so happy to chat about any and all things live streaming or esports as we go. So when I began this project, I began it because I was finishing my last book on esports live streaming. It had sort of suddenly broken through. And while it may be hard to believe now, esports was back then in a really precarious spot, having recently gone through a tremendous bubble that was a huge blow to North American competitive gaming in particular. Live streaming really, though, changed everything, as I'm sure you all well know. Twitch, a broadcast platform dedicated to gaming, which spun off from the social cam site Justin TV in June 2011, has in a handful of years dramatically reshaped the landscape. The site now boasts, and these figures change constantly, so these were the ones that were relevant about a month ago, but the site now boasts 2.2 million unique broadcasters per month, with 27,000 plus members in the Twitch Partner Program and 150,000 creators in the Affiliates Program. And both partners and affiliates earn money on their creations. And one of the things I spend a lot of time talking about in the book is the transformation from kind of free UGC to what it means for people to want to get paid for their creations. There's also about 15 million daily active users now on the site. And as you probably know, it hosts a wide variety of games from a variety of genres. So in May 2012, I was sitting on my sofa browsing the internet when I stumbled on a website, Twitch, showing a live feed of a StarCraft II computer game tournament taking place in Paris, and maybe some of you saw this as well. In esports competitions, professional players compete in a formal tournament setting for prize money. Given my prior research, I was familiar with game broadcasting attempts over the years, and in fact, in my book on esports, I chronicle several attempts at esports broadcasting, one on television in particular. But this production particularly caught my eye. This was Iron Squid. The event was taking place at the beautiful Le Grand Rex Concert Hall. The camera shots of an energetic, cheering audience of over 2,000 people were interspersed with live feeds of the game competition. The strange world of StarCraft, maybe not so strange if you play it, populated and fought over by human Terrans, otherworldly Protoss, and creepy insectoid Zergs, shared screen time with the faces of players, commentators, and audience that filled the large theater. Yet there was also another set of spectators, ones solely participating online, like myself. Along with thousands of others around the world, I was watching this match in real time over the internet. On our screens, alongside the video piping out from Paris, a chat stream, in fact an old school IRC channel, flowed by with hundreds of people talking to each other about the event and cheering through text and emoticons. Now, someone who had not only studied gaming, but also has roots in internet studies, virtual environments, and synchronous computer-mediated communication, my research ears perked up, and I'm sure some of you have had that experience too when you see something and you think, What caught my attention was not only the spectatorship, it was also the forms of communication and presence among broadcasters and audience, both on-site at the venue and distributed through the network. I was intrigued by the experience as a media event. This show was being broadcast to a huge global audience, and as I came to learn over the course of that night, was being talked about in a variety of other online spaces such as Twitter. I had my television on in the background, but soon turned that volume down. This game channel, broadcast on my laptop, now captured my full attention, and it was pretty immediately clear to me that I needed to explore this space. A little bit like my esports book, when I first started the esports research, I went to a tournament intending to just sort of talk to players, and I met my first team owner, and I thought, oh, wow, there's a lot more going on here. And Twitch was a little bit the same. I thought I was going to do one article on esports and broadcasting, and once I started looking, I thought, oh, wow, there's a lot more here. So like many people my age, I grew up with television. It was a constant part of my everyday life, and watching this broadcast resonated in ways that were really deeply familiar to me. Though I've remained a television viewer my entire life, like many, I also came to spend a lot of time online and in gaming spaces. This broadcast, and I would argue Twitch in general, seemed to weave together all of these threads at once. It was an interesting collision of the televisual, computer games, the internet, and computer-mediated communication. Game live streaming is an excellent example of the ways multiple cultural trajectories collide and iterate. It evokes structures and modalities associated with television, but also fits within broader cultures of gaming and spectatorship, user-generated content, and telecommunications. It is an emerging form of what I now call networked broadcasting, as a play on network broadcasting. This is entertainment that is typically rooted around traditional media production and distribution outlets, tapping into gaming fandom and the pleasures of spectatorship, harnessing the evocative power of otherwise mundane webcams, and piggybacked on as well as created net culture. To some, it may seem like game live streaming has come out of left field. It is, however, tied to a longer historical trajectory of television and internet broadcasting, yet simultaneously deeply rooted in our contemporary moment, which is filled with online media services, maker DIY movements, online life, and creative cultural production from all sectors of society. Its vibrancy is as a live media product, both like TV and something much very different. And in the book, I try to trace some of these different threads and link up what's happening in live streaming to transformations in the media industry more broadly. So you can think about Netflix, binging, media on demand. Within esports, formalized competitive computer gaming, there has actually long been a quest to see gaming make the shift to television, despite many bumpy attempts over the years. The hope in those old days was that if esports could just get onto television, not only would its legitimacy be signaled, but the audience for it could grow significantly. That TV dream never quite paid off. And with the rise of sites like Twitch, many of the people I've known for years in esports began saying, we don't need TV, we have live streaming. As one put it, there's no point in taking esports to television because anyone that's already interested in it is online. It's like saying, hey, we need to take this baseball game and play it inside Times Square because there's more people walking around there, right? It doesn't work that way. There's no point to force a gamer to walk away from his PC and watch it on television. Major esports tournaments will now, typically over the course of a weekend, reach millions of viewers. The most major televised sports events will still have numbers that trump esports live streaming in terms of audience size, and specific numbers for any single session should be taken with some caution, and I'm happy to chat more about what I think is the kind of hype bubble we're in right now. The overall growth of live streaming as a medium for new forms of broadcasting game content is indisputable. Though thinking about waves in any domain risk obscuring the threads of continuity or earlier experiments that never caught on, it can be helpful in broad strokes to describe esports this way, especially for those who may not know much about gaming. Though we're currently in a boom period for the scene, it's helpful to remember that formalized competitive gaming has been around since the beginning of computer games, and it's been morphing and transforming along the way. This is a very crass distillation of some histories and trajectories. And again, I'm always hesitant to mock up something like this. There really are threads of continuity betwixt and between. The first wave, covering the 70s and 80s, was anchored in arcades and around home console machines where the local dominated. Game was the predominant frame for this moment, and it was rooted in enthusiast and serious leisure communities. Amateur and pro-am orientations and competitions dominated. The second wave, from the 1990s through 2010, leveraged the power of the internet for multiplayer connections and a more global formulation of competitive space. And for the purposes of this conversation, I now want to hone on a couple things. Sport at that moment, in the period of time where I was writing my esports book, became the predominant frame for that period, with the rise of third-party organizations who were producing sustained infrastructures for competition, formalization, and professionalism. Sport took over as the dominant rubric for not only players, but also many ancillary actors involved. That period also witnessed the power of networking as a means to jumpstart an esports industry. And I often say when I was writing my esports book, I used the word industry and I was really hesitant about it because I wasn't quite sure if it was full-fledged enough to be called that, and I'm glad I did, because I think we decidedly have an esports industry at this point. The third wave, starting around 2010, has as its core the growth of live streaming that takes the power of the networking we saw earlier and combines it with the televisual. It is during this period that esports has become not just a sports product, but a media entertainment outlet as well. Serious attention is given to it, media production, audience, and entertainment. Infrastructures, both organizational and technical, become attuned to this as well as configure themselves for that output. Live streaming offers professional esports players and teams opportunities to build their audience, brand, and incomes while streaming their practice sessions, often straight out of their bedrooms. Tournaments are leveraging the medium to expand the reach of competitive gaming by building global audiences largely based online. Being an esports fan suddenly became much easier with live streaming. Those of you who have been esports fans for a while may remember you used to do things like have to track down game replay files and run them to see what was happening, or a video on demand, or follow some niche website constantly searching out game tournaments. Twitch changed everything, and live streaming changed everything. Twitch now hosts massive amounts of esports content, from practice time to tournaments. There you can also talk to fellow audience members, follow your favorite channels to receive notifications when broadcasters go live, and subscribe to channels for a monthly fee, which among other member perks removes ads from the stream. With Twitch's purchase by Amazon in 2014, Prime members also now get additional benefits on the platform, such as free game content if they link their accounts. Having previously tracked esports, the emergence of game live streaming illuminated for me how profoundly a televisual experience combined with the power of network culture could transform a nascent industry. But it's important to remember how long esports has been working to bring spectatorship to the scene, though. I have to say, as often as not, even though I'm a sociologist, I feel I've become a historian over the last 15 years of doing game studies, because we often forget these histories or longer trajectories. While live streaming has been a major amplifier, early enthusiasts were working hard to innovate broadcasting from the beginning. At this moment, where we're now in an esports boom or perhaps hype cycle, it's easy to forget how many were working hard to create not just esports, but broadcasting long before game developers saw money to be made from entering the space. So these are a few shots. This is a red-eye Paul Chalonier, who I met at DreamHack 2006, where he was solely doing audio broadcasting, which was something early esports producers were relying on. WCG, World Cyber Games, back in 2006, 2007. Backstage, early shots. New Egg Landfest, 2007. So whether it was via early audio broadcast, and these were some of the companies around back then, whether it was via early audio broadcast through technologies like shoutcast servers or taking off-the-shelf AV components and stringing them together in ways not previously intended, early esports producers were intent on extending the reach of spectatorship beyond the live crowd. And I have to say, a large part of what I've ended up doing in this book is really looking at media production practices, going behind the scenes and looking at the labor and work that folks are doing. So as one early producer described it to me, I think in some regards this world is pushing technology, esports production, broadcast, or using tools that traditional broadcasting uses in a very set way and jackknifing it and doing stuff it was never meant to do. Little basic things like a basic ATM switcher you can buy from Black Magic that a lot of churches and other public service things use have certain limitations. That's the way it is. But if you're a nerd, you can get around these things. You can make hacks and macros and things that they don't tell you about. It's not an add-on you would buy. So there's nerds that build computers. We have all these guys that are nerding out on capture cards. In my previous work, I showed how esports was never just about playing the game as given out of the box, but tweaking and modifying it for the kind of experience competitors want. In much the same way, esports broadcasting is deeply tied to a long history of bricolage, modifying systems, conceptualizing audiences, and transforming gameplay into a new televisual product. These early innovations have now been picked up and extended by a range of media producers, some of whom have long histories in esports, others who are new to it, and still others whose expertise lay in traditional media outlets. And in fact, one of the most profound changes we've seen with the rise of live streaming is the growth of a kind of backstage media industry to produce esports. So I'm sure probably, how many people have watched esports tournaments on Twitch? Yeah, okay. So these few images I want to show you now are really what it looks like backstage, and I find people are often surprised by how much media production is happening backstage to make those Twitch tournaments happen. So this is IEM San Jose 2015. Networking is a huge part of what's happening. This is IEM Comic-Con 2013. Oh, so this one is 2015, IEM Comic-Con. Esports productions now, as they're going from tournament to tournament, go around with fly packs, basically. All the stuff gets packed up. This team and all of this gear gets shipped to the next events. It gets all laid out as a little mini television studio at the back of these conventions. And this was one of the more recently, these were all images I have from my field work. One of the more interesting ones recently, the E-League, which is actually on television, where Turner Broadcasting rolled up the big trucks that they use for the Olympics and all kinds of other sports, and we're broadcasting E-League. So this is one of the truck production setups. And these have a range of directors and technical crew, and it looks like any sports production you might see. When you go now backstage at events, what you see is both deeply connected to the specificity of gaming. Think about the role, and I'm going to push this one back, the in-game observer here in Feza. Think about the role of in-game observers, for example, who act as skilled camera operators. But it also looks more and more like traditional media practices and forms of professionalization. While most are familiar with the growth of esports, the transformations happening behind the scenes around labor and frameworks that situate esports as entertainment might be less obvious but deeply important. Many challenges and possibilities have come with the growth of live streaming and the development of esports as a form of networked broadcast. In my remaining time, I want to highlight two critical issues facing this new media environment and industry. And I'll just add on here, I'm not going to talk about today, though it's always dear to my heart, are things around intellectual property. So if you want to talk about esports and intellectual property, especially as we talk about broadcasting, I'm happy to do that. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now on that. And of course, you can pick up my book to hear about the rest of these things if you want. So let's talk about managing digital stadiums and the construction of audiences. While an important component to esports broadcast has become the show on-site at the venue, another critical part of a stream is the chat happening within the platform, live alongside the content coming through the tournament. Drew Harry, the lead of the data science team at Twitch, has astutely described how chat communication in these tournaments can be a digital form of a stadium crowd, complete with collective cheering. A large remote audience poses serious challenges, though, to channels that want to keep their chats intelligible or perhaps even positive. There remain issues around truly pernicious speech that happens in tournament channels, where harassment, racism, sexism, and various forms of hate speech are a sadly regular occurrence. Harassment on the platform is a major barrier, not only to entry but retention too. Legal scholar Danielle Citron argues in her extensive treatment of online harassment that these are fundamentally civil rights issues, and I'm framing this now through the language of sort of some of the US concerns we have, that warrant serious attention, prevention strategies, and focused redress. If we understand live streaming as an increasingly significant sector of media and thus cultural development, this is a major ethical and business issue. It goes to the heart of full participation, not only in media and gaming, but also popular culture and the public sphere writ large. In one of the papers published for AnyKey, an initiative to foster diversity and inclusion in esports that I co-direct with Morgan Romine, we explored a persistent theme that occurred in our conversations with professional women players who live stream, the continual harassment and abuse they face. As one of them told us, they came to think that, quote, being insulted is just a regular part of the job. For some, the toxicity became so great that they left live streaming and sometimes competition altogether. For those in the audience who witness these ongoing verbal assaults in streams, it can also be a powerful reminder of the boundary policing at work. You may come to feel quite sharply how that space simply isn't for you. Unfortunately, in the case of large esports productions, managing the community in event channels has been woefully under-attended to. The focus of tournament organizers and broadcasters has thus far tended to be on the stage productions and competitions themselves. Online chat in live stream broadcasts, where huge audiences are participating, is, if moderated at all, generally handled by bots, volunteers, and on rare occasions, a couple paid staff members. Given that many of these tournaments have millions of viewers over the course of a weekend, and as you probably know, often have millions of dollars in prize pools, with just as many lines of chat going through, this is, I think, shocking. While there have been many instances of harassment and hate speech taking place in esports streams over the years, one that brought the issue to greater public attention happened during a Hearthstone match at DreamHack Austin 2016. A large audience watching the final match between professional players Terrence and Miller, an African-American player, and Keaton Chalky Gill, as it was broadcast live over Twitch, witnessed this. Over the course of the broadcast, the chat was filled with racist abuse, hateful language, and imagery. Even though Miller himself didn't witness the hate speech in real time, others, including his family who were watching him compete, did. And he saw it all after the fact, when he got a chance to watch the broadcast as an archive where the chat played alongside it. Now, there are many devastating familiar threads in this incident. The resigned predictability of this kind of hate speech in tournament broadcasts. Miller was quoted, for example, as saying, quote, "I knew it would be bad, but I didn't think it would be that bad." The hope that people just hide the chat and the continued frustration at the lack of meaningful community management within the online spaces continues to be a problem. Yet, unlike so many other incidents of this type that had happened over the years, one important difference occurred this time. A moderator publicly spoke out, writing up the process, called out the organizers to account. So in a piece posted on the popular esports website Gosu Gamers, Carly Toast the Badger Fieldwich, a longtime Hearthstone community member and chat moderator for DreamHack Austin, offered a really reflective accounting of what happened during the tournament and revealed the gaps that currently exist in how most moderation and community management gets handled. She specifically called out what many of us had long observed. Far too often, chat is somehow not considered organizationally central to the broadcast, and organizers do not themselves feel responsible for it. She noted the strange contrast between how much tournament organizers will do to get everything else just right and then pay little attention to what happens when it all hits the broadcasting space. She astutely observed that the failure of DreamHack to properly moderate the channel is all too common pattern, where many organizers simply do not put in the time, labor, and I'd argue money into actually building out robust community management. Her account painted a devastating portrait of a moderation team made up of volunteers, many of whom were working hard to keep the chat running from off the rails, while others were actively undermining them. The lack of clear guidelines, training, and accountability is striking. This is a little GIF somebody made of 2 tournament chats. Just keep cycling. It is also sadly unsurprising. When reading her recounting of the incident, I couldn't help but think about the long-standing pattern in both gaming and social media, the lack of meaningful community management. And I imagine, those of you who are working on game design and development, hopefully, probably are already thinking about this issue. Over and over again, both game developers and other platforms build tremendous communities and capital and value by having users constantly engaging with each other, producing content, deeply building value by their presence and interactions. Yet at the same time, it is stunning how underprepared and undercommitted companies can be to managing those communities. They want the value that all those people create, but on the cheap. From Twitter's ongoing foot dragging on tools and processes to combat harassment, to games that continue to be a home to a consistently toxic culture. Companies continue to want to bring people onto their platforms, but neglect them once there. Far too often, corporate calculations focus on high daily active user counts while not investing in making these safe spaces sustainable. Not only are there real ethical issues with this approach, there's also long-term economic costs to this lack of attention. Harassing and toxic behavior have the concrete impact of pushing other users off the platform, keeping some of them from joining and participating at all. Game developer Jessica Mulligan's 2003 book, Developing Online Games, called on the industry more than 15 years ago to take community management as a core aspect of production. The minute you put multiple players together, you need to realize that you are now also in the business of community. Esports tournaments and broadcasts have to face this similar truth. It's one thing to live stream matches, but the moment you put in a communication method for people, you have to attend to them. Tournament organizers are in fact responsible for that space in the same way that owners of sports stadiums are. They're not exempt from managing the behavior that happens within them. Intervening in bad behavior on the part of attendees is incumbent on those who run the venue, and online spaces are no different. Most traditional sports stadiums have attendee codes of conduct. I'd love to hear how it is here in Finland, I don't know. In some, you can even do confidential texting so you can get somebody to help you without drawing risky attention to yourself. These codes, of course, by no means fully prevent bad things from happening. There remains more that needs to be done on building inclusive traditional sporting communities. But the presence of codes and methods of enforcement, visible staff, mechanisms to reach out for help, signal a fundamental understanding of responsibility from the organizers, that what happens in the stadium is part of the experience that they are accountable for. Esports organizers need to come to recognize that their live streaming and chat spaces are part of a digital stadium that they must manage responsibly. There's also an economic angle that, if nothing else, broadcasters and game developers should certainly care about. For those who are really concerned with long-term growth, understanding how your product is affected, both symbolically and practically, by the chat is critical. One organizer noted the impact a bad stream can have on potential sponsors, saying, "I don't want to see them scared away. You know you're doing a listen-in, and people are dropping racial slurs or using the F-bomb and stuff like that. It takes away so much from the space. It only sets us back. Esports is still, although growing, too fragile to have any setbacks, where people are publishing really bad stuff about it." Even just sticking to the main demographic that esports chases after, young men, it's important to realize that many of them also don't want to inhabit toxic spaces. It is woefully short-sighted to overlook the tremendous impact that unmoderated channels have on industry growth. Before you propose we simply write off chat or hide it, I'd actually push back. The power of real-time communication, even if it's just what happens when a crowd comes together to cheer, is important for us not to lose. Can you imagine sitting in an actual, real offline sports stadium with a silent crowd? No. Right. In the bigger picture of live streaming, chat can be a key way audiences come together, and not just with broadcasters, but with each other. This is a little image of one of the very talented, hardworking moderators handling moderation for a multitude of channels simultaneously. Yeah, there's a lot more I can say about moderation, but I'll just leave that there. They do tremendous work, moderators. Rather than writing off chat completely, more must be done to use the tools out there, from Twitch's own auto-mod system to the fantastic work of bots that have been generated by the community itself. Tournament organizers also need to start having integrated community management plans that take the work of moderators seriously. Volunteer moderators, and I will tell you, Twitch chat is largely moderated by volunteers who are basically doing huge services and labor, and it's kind of professional job that they don't get paid for. Volunteer moderators do tremendous amounts of labor trying to keep broadcast chats decent, and companies need to do more to actually recognize this form of specialized labor and build in better structures to support and development. I'll turn to the second issue I want to discuss now. This issue about how digital stadiums will function ties to another issue: how to think about audiences. As esports has become a new kind of media product, audiences play a tremendously important role, both symbolically and economically. In the case of traditional sports, women actually make up significant portions of both stadium and broadcast audiences. People of color and LGBTQ folks are an always present part of sports and gaming player bases, audiences, and leisure communities. If you are fostering, even through negligence, the construction of an online stadium where a large slice of the audience will not want to spend time, you're affecting your bottom line. Conversely, if you work to build spaces that accommodate diverse audiences and construct possibilities for fandom along with engagement, especially in the current esports climate, you're likely to be well ahead of your competitors. There are always imagined audiences in play when companies are working out event details regarding how it will be packaged, marketed, and sold. And those of you who do design work can probably now think about the imagined user, the imagined player, the imagined gamer that's always working all design and development work. Even post-event hype reels are tied up with audience construction and deployed as sales devices for future events. This isn't unique to esports or live streaming more generally, but rather part of the way that content sits within a commercialized sphere. Media studies scholar Toby Miller has pointed out that producers don't simply want to attract viewers, but want to, quote, make audiences. Now, audiences are not a given empirical fact. They're actually constructed packagings, ways of describing, understanding, and building a mass of viewers. Organizers, platforms, game developers, publishers, advertisers, sponsors, and any number of other economic actors build models of their audience. Those conceptualizations in turn get fed back into the system and work to reproduce segmentation. This is where I think thinking about some of the language and work from media studies and television studies is actually helpful for us. So audience making is always ongoing work, but is particularly important to consider now at a time of tremendous growth in esports. Though developers have made strides in understanding that there are heterogeneous users for their products, much more still needs to be done. A major factor continues to be deep misunderstandings about how leisure and gender operate in people's daily lives. While cultural expectations around who plays games have changed quite a bit in the last 15 years, esports is still playing catch up, and in fact I would say esports is woefully behind the curve. The belief that women are outside the core for esports has unfortunately also now spread to audience construction. So this is where once you start putting live streaming in, you get this whole other new circuit of ideology around gender and play. Women are not seen as important stakeholders in terms of spectatorship, and by extension are sidelined from its economic underpinnings. Put simply, over and over again, young men age 18 to 25 or 32 or 34, it gets constructed in different ways, are framed as the prize demographic for esports sponsors and advertisers. In turn, events and broadcasts are primarily constructed with them in mind. They are hailed constantly in broadcasts in a variety of ways and become an imagined audience that ends up holding tremendous meta-institutional power. Part of this stance comes from a long-time truism in advertising that sees young men, and often it means young white men, as valuable consumers unable to be reached via traditional paths. And maybe you've heard this rhetoric before. Advertisers are thus always on the watch for new ways to get their message out to this imagined tough-to-reach audience. Esports has, quite instrumentally, piggybacked on this panic by prominently building into its sales models the claim that they know that market segment well and can reach it effectively. This is not by any stretch a hidden rhetoric. If you listen to any number of public interviews with execs, this notion is clearly touted as a prime strength of the product. The rhetoric about who the valued audience is represents a collision of survival pragmatism amongst esports companies and ideologies of gender and race. Esports companies are desperate to find sponsors wherever they can, and have not shied away from tapping into hackneyed models. And this point, I would say, is part of, it's very easy right now to get caught up in the hype of esports, and you read these reports that say there's tons of money and it's all out there. There's still tremendous precarity in the esports industry, and that precarity drives a lot of decisions that we might want to pause at otherwise. Yet, as we've seen from game studies research over the years, there's a gap between how industry actors conceive of their space and what is empirically evidenced. I certainly recall in the earliest days of massively multiplayer online game research how many of us had an abundance of data on the women playing, as well as motivations that disrupted easy stories about what women like, only to be consistently met with industry resistance. More often than not, that pushback belied deeper assumptions about gender than actual user practices. Indeed, if you had looked at the qualitative work emerging early on in game studies, you would have clearly seen cultural transformation in motion. Computer gaming was moving from activity mostly taken up by boys and men to a leisure activity also for women and girls across their life cycle. Conversations in esports feel much the same. We're seeing more and more women playing games like League of Legends, Overwatch, and other competitive titles, turning up to esports events, watching streams online, and developing fandom around games, players, and teams, only to then be framed by the industry that they are a negligible slice, anomalies, not the core demographic. Barriers to entry and retention are constantly reasserted despite women's expressed interest in competitive gaming. From the lack of hailing in stories, advertising, and visuals to outright harassment, women who try to enter esports in sustained ways, even as spectators, regularly face challenges. Given how much of the esports economy relies on sales, from advertising to deals with developers and publishers or other sponsors, there are huge incentives to construct a demographic profile of esports fans that can then be said to be captured and offered back to those advertisers and sponsors who have an idea of what their real audience is. Traditional advertising fears that it has lost the ability to reach young men dovetails into esports companies who are often in dire straits to stay afloat, confidently proclaiming they have the prized demographic to be offered up. It's easy enough to see how this move starts out as harmless. That demographic, without a doubt, makes up an important part of the esports fandom, especially historically. But the problems set in when it gets conceived as unchanging and the primary audience. As an empirical consideration mutates into an ideological one, other props, such as industry reports and repeated stereotypes, get raised to help perpetuate what has become an overly narrow understanding of audience. The people esports sales teams are selling to, be they advertisers, sponsors, or game developers and publishers, often have audience models that tend toward a fairly conservative and outdated view of games as the domain of primarily young men. Pitching alternate productions and audience formulations simply doesn't get traction. And again, we actually probably need a lot more kind of political economy of the games industry to understand how these things work. I've talked to a number of esports folks who would like to do something different, but because of the way the industry is structured and funded, they get trapped in having to sell products to people who may not still fully understand gaming. The upshot is this continued same old models in which the imagined audience member is a single young man. This only helps reify that dominance of the demographic in everybody's minds. If you keep surrounding yourself with that model of participation, it's not surprising that you start thinking it is reality, which in turn limits how you might formulate more up-to-date possibilities. The cost of this decidedly unvirtuous circle has been several decades of inequitable access and participation opportunities for women and girls to digital playing fields. And I think we can actually fruitfully extend this critique to talk about race as well, and I'm happy to do that. Those constructions are now flowing over into audience issues. The reliance, and I want to just say a few kind of social science method-y things now. The reliance on poor data in particular continues to produce profound misunderstandings of actual audiences' uptake and use. There are, I think, at least 3 major culprits at work in this: surveys, algorithmically generated data and profiling, and big data. It's important for not just researchers, but also those in the industry who aren't analysts but often rely on that work to understand the methodological limitations of these. So much of the industry in particular now claims to be, quote, data-driven, but stakeholders and executives often lack basic methodological social science training to evaluate the reports they're utilizing. Survey data can be tantalizing. It seems to offer big, confident, generalizable claims that are particularly easy to pull into sales decks. With free online tools like SurveyMonkey or in-house quick and dirty surveys that are offered with some kind of token game perk for participation, it can actually almost seem dumb not to do some kind of survey. But doing good survey work is hard, and it's actually not cheap. Poorly worded questions, lousy sampling can be fatal blows to good data, as well as subsequent analysis. And as television scholars noted decades ago, watching television is a more complex category than might appear at first glance. And quantitative measures often don't fully capture varying contexts, along with nuanced behaviors and attitudes. Algorithmically generated data and profiling, and their companion of big data, represent the newest in the arsenal of data-driven analytics that are especially used in online spaces. They arise from an orientation that assumes most meaningful data can be automatically captured via platforms and various data sets. For example, frequent buyer card tracking or purchasing data from credit card companies, and without sampling, so there's no need to consider if you have the right sample at all. There's often an unquestioning belief that all this data will offer clear patterns and trends. There remain several serious, often fatal challenges to these methods when trying to understand leisure, gaming, live streaming, and esports in particular. These data are produced with little consideration of multi-device use, shared accounts, non-signed-in use, everyday context, and how people actually understand and give meaning to their own actions. Usually sign-up processes don't actually collect data such as gender, much less data that can be then meaningful linked across all behavior. Graphs that show big bucket categories like time watched sidestep the fact that they can't actually capture watching. At best, they can simply show how long something played on a screen. They can't capture the other people in the room who weren't signed in, but themselves watching and engaged. They can't capture multi-screen or multitask context. Fundamentally, they capture only the coarsest of things, such as the number of calls made to a server to receive data. Perhaps the most pernicious, though, are the ways that big data and algorithmically generated systems are utilized in deeply conservative ways. I don't mean this in a political sense, but rather in a social scientific one. Such models often assume that you are a man or a woman because you do things identified as what men or women do. This means, for example, that a woman who has leisure patterns or interests that look like what has been bucketed together as a man's may in fact be miscategorized as a man according to the system. This is from my Twitter feed just recently, where I learned that Twitter categorized me as a man. Doesn't really tell me why it did it, though it says it's somehow associated with my interests. They're my interests. I encourage you to look at your Twitter data. Google categorized me as a man probably 6 years ago as well. Okay. So data pulled from that system and sloppy analysis is then fed back into lousy analytics that only reinforce stereotypes. Simply put, women who do male things look like just more men to the system, and vice versa. Only after a massive shift has occurred in the culture, typically one that bubbles up enough to redefine what a man or woman can do without stigma, will this discrepancy get dealt with. In the meantime, counterexamples, innovators, trendsetters, and behaviors that simply don't fit dominant cultural models may be rendered invisible, irrelevant outliers, and wholly misunderstood. One of the most significant problems with quantitative data in the domain of gender and leisure is that it is usually unable to capture the fast-shifting spaces and changes in cultural patterns as well as preferences. And more often than not, these so-called data are captured in huge swaths with no rigorous interpretive work as a component of the analysis. While such approaches are meant to get at actual behavior and not claimed identities, in practice they lag too far behind what are really complex constellations of user activities and how people understand themselves, engagements that shift far too quickly for quantitative models to usually account for. The issue of changing leisure patterns is tremendously important, not only for researchers, but also stakeholders who are keenly attuned to the rise and fall of markets. Capturing a known market or demographic is one thing. Being ahead of your competitors can be a critical business advantage. Growth spots are frequently where people are at or want to be, but that haven't been saturated or leveraged by others yet. Big cultural shifts are also unpredictable, although once upon us, they can kind of seem inevitable. Think, for example, about the mainstream changes that World of Warcraft, Minecraft, or even Pokemon Go fostered. As someone who had previously done work on massively multiplayer online games, I remember being amazed when that small slice of game culture became, for a time, a huge part of the popular conversation, with coverage reaching even mainstream outlets like the New York Times. Maybe you remember that moment where it seemed like everybody was playing WoW for a little while. Minecraft popularized user-generated content as well as watching your favorite gamers on YouTube to millions of kids. Most recently, Pokemon Go crystallized the powerful potential of alternate reality games, a genre that's actually existed in various forms for decades. All these practices and platforms previously existed before a particular title burst on the scene. All of them became mainstream cultural objects and activities that crossed gender lines and became popular forms of leisure not strictly tied to any activity. We've now seen within esports how the introduction of live streaming has opened up the audience for competitive gaming in significant ways. It's brought more mainstream attention in just a few years than decades of work had. Time and again, I've heard from women and, to be frank, men, about how they went from enjoying playing League of Legends or Dota 2 with their friends or family to being amazed and excited about esports once they went to a barcraft, saw their first live match, or even just watched a tournament online. The rise and amplification of these massive events via live streaming highlight how a long trajectory of subculture can often burst through in unexpected, unanticipated ways. Models of audience, especially around gender, must be agile enough to handle these big cultural shifts. This attention to broader audiences is something that traditional sports have had to face after decades of serious neglect. Major sports leagues have, albeit with some missteps, begun to recognize that women make up an important part of their audience demographic and are starting to attend to them. Rather than rely on outdated notions of an advertising industry behind the curve, I'd assert that developing the audience for women in esports is much easier than it was for bringing them into soccer or any other number of traditional sports. In the case of gaming, we already have women playing all kinds of titles and integrating gaming into their everyday lives. We now have lots of data that show they're there as engaged players, and we know women are avid fans and attendees of things like Comic-Con, Anime Fest, PAX, and any other number of fan gatherings. Women and girls now have a history of engaging in sports and identifying as athletes and have come to thrive in competitive spaces. These are critical factors for esports audience construction because they're about how forms of leisure come to be accepted as a part of gender identities, preferences, and possibilities that weren't before. It's stunning that an industry so willing to push the frontier with new ideas about what might count as a sport would rely on outdated models of gender. Perhaps what's most ironic about esports' continued unwillingness to question its own assumptions about gender, audience, and participation is that traditional sports, a waypoint it constantly uses, themselves had to start wrangling with exactly these issues decades ago. Well, I'd never want to predict where esports will be as an industry in 5 or 10 or 20 years. What's clear is that live streaming has played a profound role in its development as a new form of sports entertainment. What began in hobbyist and enthusiast communities has developed into a new branch of the media industries, complete with professionals and new forms of division of labor behind the scenes. We'd be well served to keep our eyes not only on the promise, but some of the perils I raise here today. Games matter, as does full participation in them, whether it is as a player or a spectator. Thanks.
TL, for your lecture and very interesting points and critique for the growing phenomenon. Is there any questions from the audience that you would like to raise? There will be the throwing mic. So while I'll hit my questions, feel free to think about those. So, well, at least maybe we could start with a question from the stream. There was one question. So what do you think is going to happen with the huge bubble that live streaming is right now? Is it going to stabilize eventually, or do you see some negative outcome for the extremely rapid growth? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So one of the things I discuss in my book are the different models of revenue generation that esports companies are currently playing with when it comes to live streaming. And I really mean playing with. Nobody has quite figured out how to make money in this space yet. So there are lots of different experimentations. I don't know what's ultimately going to happen. A lot of it's going to come down to whether or not they figure out a way to actually generate meaningful revenue long-term from streaming. Advertising hasn't actually panned out. You probably know this yourself if you use things like ad blockers. Getting enough sort of good ad inventory has been a problem historically. So there's lots of experiments. It's going to depend, I think, a lot on that. But right now, as I say, I do think we're in a bit of a bubble. And there's a lot of hype around how much money there is, but it's also going to matter how that money flows through the system. Is it just going to be a few people kind of holding the majority of it? Or, for example, are players going to sort of get enough? Are team owners going to get enough?
So what are the kind of signs that we can say that this is a bubble? What do you, like, how do you express that?
Yeah. I guess for me, I take two things in hand. One is, and you've probably seen, whether it's popular press or industry reports that proclaim there are billions of dollars circulating and available in the esports revenue space. When I talk to people on the ground day to day, it's all still, how are we going to make money? It's all still, what is revenue going to look like long term? And one of the things that's really important, I encourage you, those of you who are doing game development, to recognize the role things like industry reports play. You know, those reports are not transparent social science works. They serve a purpose. Those industry reports get taken up, packaged, put into sales decks that then get sold. Sales decks that are pitching sales either to internal stakeholders or advertisers. So it's this kind of internal loop that it reflects a lot of speculation and it reflects a lot of hope things are going to shake out. I don't think esports is not going to go away, live streaming isn't going to go away, but there is going to be some settling in terms of how much revenue is actually going to get made. And one last thing I'll say too is that's deeply tied to how game developers stay and start controlling the space even more. Esports historically has been something game developers have not cared about. They only started caring when live streaming came along, and they began to see it as a form of press and marketing. And that means right now there's a lot of third-party companies who are still trying to figure out where they're going to lie then in this space. Game developers tend to claim full ownership for their IP. So that means you have a whole level of third-party companies who are trying to build revenue and make money off of things that actually aren't their own IP. So there's a very interesting, delicate balance right now. And again, that's going to have to be sorted out long term.
Yeah, like personally, I've tried some streaming, and it's kind of difficult to even kind of get from the developers information whether they would like the game to be streamed or not. So it's definitely a developing scene where we kind of need to have more models on that.
Yeah, so one of the chapters in the book is on variety streamers, and variety streamers are interesting because at least the ones I interviewed and spent a lot of time with, folks who are trying to make money off of user-generated content. That is actually IP that developers want to own and control. And so far they've kind of let people do that because it's seen as good marketing. That to me poses really interesting challenges when you think about the development of culture. You know, if your live stream can only be framed as good marketing, that may pose some limits we might not want on that form of media. Maybe you want to be able to be critical. Maybe you have some right to your production. So one of the things I argue in the book is that live streamers are often creating entirely new kinds of work that game developers shouldn't get to claim to own, that they are doing transformative work, and we have to understand how people have a right to produce content through games that a game developer can't say, no, you can't do that anymore. So yeah, it is really one of the most kind of both legally and culturally messy things happening right now. Messy in a good way, but messy.
So what can we actually learn from the decades of research of televisual and kind of that viewers' understanding, or vice versa? What can that field learn from the current esports and streaming culture? Because there's obviously new things happening, and they bleed to the traditional viewing as well.
Yeah. I mean, I've long thought one of the mistakes game studies has made is it's tended to pitch itself as this fully interactive medium, and then there's those televisions and couch potatoes. And it's actually, that framework misunderstands a lot of the really fantastic work in television studies, which understands viewership as active and engaged in particular ways, understands how we situate the stuff in our lives, in our everyday lives. So I think there's a lot we can learn from that. For example, one of the things I have found in doing my work in live streaming is that it's not unusual for people to leave live streams on all day. I think of it as kind of ambient sociality. You know, I don't know if any of you do that. You have your stream there, and they're just on. You know, you have your favorite channels are going. Well, in television studies, we understand that people often have a television on all day, and it's part of constructing a certain kind of domestic space that has a certain auditory quality or movement. That might be interesting to get these things in conversation with the other. The other thing that's helpful is folks who study television have long, thought a lot about how, talking about television as the box, that particular piece of hardware, is not sufficient. And that's, again, something where that's why I use the word televisual, because live streaming has connections to television, even if it's not that little box. The televisual as aesthetics, as a kind of way of being, as a form of media to engage with, that extends over to live streaming. So I see a lot of back and forth between those spaces.
There's a question about future of mobile esports.
Yeah.
What would you like to say about that? Is there any?
Yeah. So I used to be really skeptical, and then two things happened. I went to India, maybe it was now 2 years ago, and I got to spend a day hanging out with people who are like trying to build esports in India. And they were like, look, our infrastructures are different. And if we're going to have esports here, it's not going to be because we are all sitting at our home PCs with fantastic internet. It's going to be constructed around the infrastructures and cultural practices we have, which is like, of course, right? That's how it is in every country. So that happened. And I started thinking, well, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Like they were doing things to bring live streaming to India. They were setting up like your local game cafe was where you would go to live stream. So like it was your production space. So they were even like reconceptualizing game cafes. So that was one thing. The other thing that happened was we had Tencent come to MIT and we did some exhibition matches with one of their mobile games. And I was like, oh, this actually works. It worked as a visual presentation. It worked for a broadcast. And I started thinking, and again, we are so PC-centric sometimes in Europe and North America, to the detriment of thinking about mobile, and also we don't think about how profound console play is. What does console play look like? Fighting game scene has been around for decades, is hugely vibrant, is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse, but because esports has gotten framed around PCs, we often kind of forget it. And so I've actually come to think there's tremendous potential. I mean, devil's in the details, skill caps in games, but when we start looking at places like China and India, there's going to be different formulations coming out of places with different infrastructures.
Within the TV world, there is also talk about the second screen experiences, which might be actually the primary screen experience these days.
Yeah.
So that kind of connects to the mobile esports as well, and kind of that field that we utilize different spaces in attending these
absolutely.
Situations.
Yeah, it's funny because when I started the live streaming work, I don't know if this language, but the second screen stuff and kind of social TV were really like popular terms. And I remember just thinking like, live streaming has you folks blown out of the water, because like it tended to mean like you're watching Game of Thrones and you're tweeting, and it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that's social TV, but like, can you just look at Twitch and see all these people talking to broadcasters and talking to each other? Like, to me, it always struck me as a richer formulation. So, yeah, I think there's a lot happening in that space around even those terms.
Yeah. Okay, then there is one more question from the chat. What do you think about the lifespan of games in esports?
Mm-hmm.
StarCraft 1 tournament in South Korea lasted slightly more than 1 decade, but now replaced by new games.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a concern that recent game titles might have much shorter lifespan, either by loss of commercial popularity, much fast-changing hardware or software updates, etc. So what game developers should consider if they want to have their game last long enough as esports?
So I'm not a designer or developer, so I'm never going to try to come up with a recommendation. Historically, communities are the ones that decide if a game is going to be an esports title. And that ranges from if, a community decides that the game has the right level of kind of skill cap, if it's modifiable in particular ways, whatever it may be. So League of Legends is the anomaly in this story. They set out to make an esports game. They made one by virtue of having a lot of money also to put in the scene. So I don't, what makes a good esports game is complex. It's certainly true that, there are a couple of titles that have really long histories. Counter-Strike, of course, is still being played. And, but it is a funny thing with live streaming, right? Because you also now have this new marketing and publicity mechanism that may help other games reach an audience more quickly. We are seeing a lot of changeover, but again, Counter-Strike is still getting played, and there's still some fighting games that are getting played. So I always just feel like any developer who sets out to I'm going to make the next big esports game hit really needs to realize that communities decide what game is going to become a popular esports title. There are a lot of, the ground is littered with failed next big esports title projects, in part because I think sometimes developers don't understand or don't pay attention to the work communities do to make a game an esports title. So I have no predictions. I'm not a designer or developer, so I can't.
But what could we learn from sports studies, that there's this huge durability of the communities? Is it very community-driven design? I've heard some talks about how the design of the games are updated all the time for the viewer's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that something that is now much more kind of interesting to the game developers as well, to look from the sports?
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes games people don't realize how much traditional sports is itself iterated and often based on its relationship to broadcast television. So, rules in traditional sports change all the time as television broadcast technology changes or as audience formulation changes. So, and we also know traditional sports changes in relation to equipment. Again, we often imagine it's a static field, but do you remember years ago when certain kind of Speedo swimsuit was not allowed to be used because the technology actually changed speeds at which swimmers are? It was they're pits of technology. I think wasn't it in football, soccer years ago? The ball, there was a whole thing around the ball technology. So we sometimes forget that in games, those kind of constant iterations. And of course that happens in games, the technology matters. I remember, probably some of you remember this because you lived through it, the transition from CRTs to LCDs It changed how the game was played. People had to adapt to that. So those changes are always a part of both sports and esports, and living with change, and also recognizing when your competitive player base is signaling changes that should happen and being willing to go with that and experiment, I think is important. I don't know if I hit your question, but.
Yeah. Well, I have a kind of additional question to this. Rami Ismail was here last year talking about how, the streaming, and we've had other speakers also addressing that the streaming experience is part of the design now. Also designing your community, as you were speaking in your talk, that it's part of the design now. Yeah. But that becomes every time more and more complex to teach people game design, because everything seems to be easily part of design. So I don't know, do you have any tricks or tips how to solve this? How do we do the education?
I'll have to go back and listen to Rami's talk. I would be interested, because Rami was interesting because he was one of the first developers who actually leveraged live streaming for the process. And I think, again, I'm not a developer or designer, but I can imagine, as with any creative process, live streaming is very hard work to do it right. When you watch a live stream, it may not seem like it, even if you watch a variety streamer. But behind the scenes, there's a tremendous amount of labor and work involved. And I think, you have to be smart about it. You have to actually figure out, do you have the time for all that labor given your development process? And what are you actually trying to get out of it? Is it publicity for the project? Is it actually a form of user input? And if it is, how are you going to meaningfully integrate that? So I'll have to listen to Rami's talk, because I don't know if it is a really interesting challenge. And it's very easy right now to just, because you can, go on Twitch, and Twitch now hosts creative categories. But in my conversations with people, there are times when folks say, like, this thing, it's not good for the stream, either for my own process or as content, and so I'm not going to stream it. So there are really refined decisions you have to make about that.
Maybe we have a full kind of a generation of streaming natives, if that term is ever going to catch fire. So that would kind of have more insight on how to do this, because you kind of lived through these streaming experiences as a younger. Yeah,
perhaps so. Though again, I would say, and this is maybe changing, but being a successful streamer is incredibly hard work. It's a deeply specialized form of labor. It's way more than the time you're just on the screen. So like, even though all of us can stream right now, I don't know if you ever read the Twitch subreddit, you will see it is filled, and in fact, Twitch is filled with people who have 0 viewers. Most of Twitch is 0 viewers. And it's very hard to do. So even though it may be more easy technically, there's actually pretty complicated and specialized labor behind being good at it.
Is there any questions from the audience? There's one question. Go ahead. Oh, there's more. Yeah.
I have one.
I like how you're speaking into a box. I can hear you. I don't know if
I think it's in the stream, but not the.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have this question where you said that esports doesn't need television, but now there has been this really big push to create these big like global leagues around different games for League of Legends and Overwatch and that. Like, do you think that then makes sense, or is it that just an effort to get like a regular sports audience, or like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So just to be clear too.
Maybe repeat the question. In case that it wasn't in the stream.
Okay, so the question was about does esports really not need television? And with the creation of these big leagues, you could think of Overwatch League, for example, is any of that going to change? What is going to be the relationship between television and these large structures going forward? So I actually don't have, when I say esports doesn't need television, what I'm trying to convey to you there is what my respondents tell me. I will tell you one thing. One of the quotes I gave you about not needing television, I saw that same person on Twitter a while back praising E-League, which has now been on television channel, cable television. And so I DM'd them and I said, oh, I'm kind of surprised you're praising them, because you had previously said, like, we don't need TV anymore. I mean, literally my field notes are littered with old-time esports people who are like, we don't need TV anymore. And they said, oh, no, it's not that television's now the great outcome for them. It's that all of those people, they hit E-League on Turner, and then they all come to Twitch. So it's that television actually becomes a funnel for them back to the online content. And this is where what television is gets complicated, right? Because I don't know about you, but like, well, I don't have cable TV anymore. And I watch tons of stuff on streaming services. So, you know, if I'm watching my favorite TV series on a streaming service, do we call that television anymore, right? We get televisual content through lots of different places. So I think part of that is the way just bigger changes in the media industry are happening. I don't know if that gets at your question. I mean,
yeah, and I guess does the like big global league approach, like, does that make sense for esports? Does esports need that?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. There's certainly a lot of money in that gambit. I mean, so Overwatch League teams paid huge money to be in those leagues, to be in that league. And again, there's lots of hopes and propositions about where revenue is going to come from for that. There's also questions too about these leagues, you know, how much of them need to be regionalized. So Overwatch is funny, right? Because like I live in Boston, and there's like a Boston team. They don't live in Boston. They don't play in Boston. Like we all got to go to Irvine to see them. So there's both the growth of these big leagues, and there's this funny regionalism that's happening, and also live streaming content, much like traditional content. You know, when I show you these images of behind the scenes tournaments producing this content, that stuff goes out over the internet, and then often it gets picked up by national platforms that then repackage it and localize it. So if you watch like, you know, the International, the big Dota 2 tournament, you can watch the English stream, but that stuff will then get repackaged out and be on a different service in China with Chinese graphics, Chinese hosts, Chinese broadcasters. So we may need to think about global networked media and not just global television media.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, thanks.
There was more questions here. Oh, there. Let's give the mic to there and then travel it to the front.
Yeah, so on Twitch and every, like on the streaming places, what I found recently very interesting is how like Amazon, the owner of the Twitch these days, they have made their own game studio called Amazon Games.
Yeah.
And they are planning to do all of their games like Twitch, like sort of that there's a lot of like cooperation or so like that with the audiences and the streamers. And I was thinking like, is this like going to be what's coming? Like, like because like games that are constantly like the viewers can alternate them all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great question. This is where I think Twitch Plays Pokemon kicked off this idea where people started going like, oh wait, what does it mean if we can actually use a networked audience to be changing gameplay, and can we change development? I think part of what you're seeing too, I was just on, so at GDC this year, one of the panels I was on was like, it was literally the collision of every like hypey word you can think of. It was like indie, mobile, esports games, and I was like, what the, like, so part of this is just like, it's kind of hypey right now, and like, can we do all this? What I do think is live streaming isn't gonna go away. And you know, what it means to have people watch an interactive medium and where you can interact and do things with either the broadcast or the game, that's not going away. I think the risk is when developers wanna like do all of those things, indie, mobile, game, like, you know, different things may be appropriate for different games. You may not want to like shove everything into one particular title. So I don't know what's going to happen. These things are not going away, but like doing them well is a whole other thing. Like, is it a meaningful design choice? I mean, again, I'm not a designer or developer, but like, is it a meaningful choice versus just like, okay, let's figure out how to make, Grand Theft Auto like esport. Like, I literally had that conversation with somebody. I was like, what are you talking about? So meaningful choices seems important.
It seems that we are kind of starting to learn that this is fragmenting, that things are not the same trends. There are several trends that we can kind of hop on and kind of use. Yeah. So the games culture is not just one, but there's so many different things.
Absolutely, yeah. I think some of this too is, developers, developers, catch on to what users are doing already on the ground. So I think a great example of this is Twitch, now has a system where they have all of these little kind of interactive widgets you can overlay into your stream, which is really interesting. But that sensibility comes first from the users, right? Who are already putting overlays in, okay, I get a donation and now it's going to say something. So it's a little bit, developers are often lagging. Maybe this is heretical to say. I'm just going to say it. Developers are often lagging behind user practices. Users go and do all kinds of really interesting creative things, and they push software in ways, and then developers go like, oh my God, let's formalize that and turn it back. So I think part of what you're seeing is a little bit that, a lot of those user practices have been going on for decades. Moderation in Twitch is the same way. Bots were developed by the community to help moderate Twitch chat. It's only in the last handful of years that Twitch has now started formally integrating that. So, I almost feel like once developers do it, we're a few years past where the community was.
Okay, so you already talked about traditional sports a bit, but any thoughts on exogames as esports or the convergence between physical and esports? For example, why don't we have anything even moderately successful except for Dance Dance Revolution? On the other hand, there's Olympic taekwondo and fencing, for example, which are becoming video game-like with the sensors and digital processing.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you the worst answer. I don't know why we don't, but I think we are actually, right now, one of the most interesting conversations I think happening are people looking at esports and looking at all the energy in esports and going like, well, could we harness it for our domain, right? So a couple weekends ago, I was at NBA 2K esports event. So the NBA wants to get into esports, right? And so they've kind of recreated a basketball league using NBA 2K. It's not clear to me, if that's going to work. Some people say, why don't I just go to a basketball game? If I can see this one-to-one thing live, why am I not doing that? And I would imagine Extra Game might have a similar interesting challenge, why don't we just have the actual thing? I have no horse in the race on it, could work. But again, competitive communities they care a lot about if it's meaningful competition. It really matters. You can't just kind of slap it on and it works. As you probably know, if you follow an esport, people spend a lot of time thinking about rule sets and characters and what's the level cap, and we're not going to use that character because it's not a meaningful, we're not going to use that map so you have to have that kind of rich complexity available for communities to harness. And I don't know enough about exergaming to know. But yeah, I do think things like, Dance Dance Revolution, there are competitions with some of those games for a long time now. Whether they can also be transformed into a broadcast product is another really interesting challenge. So now, esports is not just a sport thing, it's a media thing now. And so all of these have to be in traditional sports, we often talk about sports media, right? Most sports are a form of sports media at this point, and it's the same thing now, I think, with esports. I don't know if that quite gets at it.
There's more and more challenges for interdisciplinary understanding of these fields.
So. Oh, yeah.
I have one question also to do with the sports field, or one more. So you were talking about how much there is volunteer work, just unpaid labor.
Yeah.
But growing in a family where my father and my brother both went to volunteer in a regular sports events and kind of build their hobby from the volunteering.
Absolutely.
Is there studies that kind of shows how much in regular sports, the traditional sports, there's volunteering work, and how much kind of we can look at these different fields and see if there's similarities or differences and how they deal that, because there's so many decades back already.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the esports book, I leaned a lot on this notion of serious leisure, which I found it a really useful concept. It comes from this guy Stebbins. Serious leisure is a way of talking about people's leisure engagement or hobbies, where they actually spend a lot of money, invest a lot of time, have heavy commitments. Like, to an outsider, you may be like, wow, isn't that your job? And it's a way of kind of splitting the difference between hobbyism and enthusiast and professionalization. And I think for me, that serious leisure model worked really well in thinking about grassroots esports and, people volunteering for these hard scrabble little companies that were trying to make it. I think I pause, to be frank, now. So people are volunteering, and a lot of it is that. And sometimes people don't want to get paid, but when you see those reports and you hear about how much money, Valve makes a ton of money every year on their major international tournament. Millions, tens of millions. I mean, you can look it up right now. They sell. When I start hearing that, and then these volunteers who are spending, 8, 10, 12 hours a day on call for the duration of a weekend to make sure a tournament chat is okay, I pause. So it's complicated because, again, a lot of folks are like, I don't want to get paid because it makes it a job. But somewhere between I don't want to get paid and actually, these people are working. And we should think about it as labor more than serious leisure, I think might be useful.
Now, at least I see that in the Finnish game company job announcements that they're looking for community managers more, kind of seeing how much more serious business is that and how critical it is.
Yeah.
So not necessarily just because it's like if you have a volunteer and then that decides not to do that anymore. If you have someone hired, it's more formalistic process also for your critical parts of the design.
Yeah. At the minimum, I would just love to see esports tournaments have a plan for their broadcasts. Honestly, a lot of them don't even have that. They kind of run broadcasts. They have maybe a few volunteers. There's actually a Discord that has just tons of people who moderate esports channels, and it's heroic volunteer labor that's often very okay, we need somebody, in a couple days, and there's no, good codes of conduct, there's no systematization, so.
I'd like to do a follow-up on that, but is there any more questions from the audience there? Can you give the mic?
Thank you. I'm Yusuke from Japan. In the Japanese case, many esports team is not sustainable, only for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
I think the reason is the income models are very limited compared to, for example, football teams. Football team have the stadium and have the hosting game to earn the income, and Center Association share the income to sell the broadcasting rights.
Yeah.
I don't think there is such a association in esports.
Yeah.
So I wonder, esports activity is sustainable in the world. What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this question about is esports actually economically sustainable for players, I would extend it to teams, is a really important issue. I think we're only now starting to see conversations brewing about things like player associations and unions. There are forms of governance and structure that we have in traditional sports that are there to protect people. They don't always work, but they're there, and I think we need them in esports. Historically, because of esports' grassroots nature, it's tended to be people are just grateful to play. You're a pro, you're dedicated. Isn't it great that you get to play? And the bar has been kind of low, and there's a high churn. But I think the more the industry becomes professionalized, people start thinking what does my retirement look like? What am I going to do when I'm done after my 3 or 5 or however many years stint? So I think these are really important questions. I hope there's more governance and regulation protecting players.
I think that maybe my follow-up is a good question kind of end this. I mean, there is a lot of turbulence in game industry and well, game cultures all the time. And do you think that that's one of the reasons why some of the development cultures are a little bit more towards reactionary than kind of, because there's too many uncertainties happening that you said that maybe there should be more planning, but if there's too many variables that can change, so you need to be more adaptive, reactionary, and maybe opportunistic. So do we have any future on other directions? Yeah,
it's a good question. I mean, especially if you're a player, you know, right now you're probably following, you know, Battle Royale has become like a huge genre now, right? And everybody's playing Fortnite. And do you remember how many months ago people were all about PUBG? And how many months, like the churn of games also makes it very precarious for players. Like, how are we going to specialize? You know, what's it going to look like to, okay, if I put all my time into this game, am I going to be able to jump to another team, another game? That doesn't happen that much. So I hadn't thought about how it mirrors perhaps churn and precarity in the games industry. That certainly seems. And probably you may agree, I'd link it even bigger, which is there's churn and precarity in our economic systems writ large right now, right? I mean, we are also in a moment of the gig economy. And you're supposed to have how many different careers over the course of your lifetime? Like, game culture and games and game development and esports, it doesn't sit outside of those bigger cultural trends. So all of those kind of economic precarities are also a part of the industries that we study as well. So we're not exempt from them.
No, yeah. Thank you, TL, for such a lovely discussion and the lecture. Yeah. We're going to stay here, have a coffee, but if you are watching the streams, thanks for tuning in, and check the recordings at the YouTube channel, Facebook page, and see you maybe in September. Bye.